Dawn had not yet broken. The sky was still thick with gray mist. Jonas Hale jolted awake to the thunderous pounding of hooves outside his rickety shack. He dragged open the creaky wooden door, and his heart suddenly tightened. Right in front of him sat more than a dozen Apache warriors on horseback, motionless like stone statues. The torchlight cast long shadows on the ground, flickering across their faces and revealing deep crimson war paint. Every gaze was sharp and cold, as if it could pierce through flesh. Leading them was an elderly chief, draped in a deerskin cloak, his black and silver hair streaming in the wind. He urged his horse forward and spoke in a voice as heavy as boulders tumbling down a cliff. "You must come with us. The tribal council has called your name." Jonas froze, his hand instinctively tightening around the rotting doorframe. He was just a poor rancher, the owner of a few scrawny cows, living in a shack with a leaky roof and crooked walls. For years, no one had paid him any mind. And yet now, a full band of warriors had surrounded his shack, as if cornering a wild beast. Flashes from the night before returned to his mind, an Apache woman collapsing in a mountain ravine, her body soaked in blood, eyes half open in the throes of death. He had knelt beside her and offered the last sip of water from his canteen, and that single sip of water had now brought him to the doorstep of destiny. Jonas Hale never imagined there would come a day when he would be summoned before an entire tribe. He had always been just a poor rancher, scraping by on the edge of Dry Creek, living in a rotting shack that could collapse in the next strong wind. He was 46 years old, a former soldier who had worn the uniform during the Civil War. He had known the smell of gunpowder and heard the sound of comrades falling beside him. When he returned home, he had nothing left but deep scars, a battered old rifle, and a pair of calloused hands. His wife and son had died during the very winter he left the battlefield. Since then, he had lived a quiet life, far from town, raising cattle and digging wells, trying to forget the noise of the world. Jonas's ranch was so poor that folks in town often spoke his name with mockery. His herd could be counted on one hand, the pastures were scorched dry, and the fences leaned like tired old men. But to him, poverty was better than chaos. At least out here, he could exist without bothering anyone. And then came last night. While leading his cattle back to the pen, he saw a figure collapse near a ravine. As he approached, he froze. It was an Apache woman, her body covered in wounds, blood soaking the cracked stones beneath her. Her eyes were barely open, trembling, and her thin hand reached out as if begging for something. Jonas stood still. He knew full well the danger of touching an indigenous person, especially a woman. In times like these, even a whisper of rumor could be enough to get him torn apart. But then, memories of his young son rushed in. That same desperate look in his eyes. Jonas could not turn away. He carried her back to the shack, lit a fire, tore up an old shirt to dress her wounds, and gave her water to drink. Just before she passed out, her cracked lips whispered a name, Ahyoka. Now, before the sun had even risen, that single act of mercy had placed him face to face with an entire tribe and with a destiny he never imagined. The oil lamp flickered in the shabby little shack, casting a pale yellow glow on the cracked wooden walls. Jonas crouched beside the fire, his calloused hands gently dipping a torn cloth into a small basin of water, then pressing it against the wound on Ahyoka's shoulder. Blood still oozed from the gash, its sharp scent mixing with the smoke in the air, thick enough to choke on. She let out a faint groan, her dark eyes fluttering open. In the firelight, Jonas could see the pain and fear etched deep in her gaze. Her trembling hand clutched at his wrist, weak, but pleading. "You are safe here. No one will hurt you," Jonas whispered, his voice rough from years of silence. Ahyoka did not understand all of his words, but she heard the calm in his tone. Her eyelids quivered, then closed again. Jonas tore another strip of cloth and wrapped it around her wrist, where dark bruises still marked the spots a rope had once dug into her skin. The night stretched on endlessly. Outside, the wind howled through the cracks in the door, whipping up clouds of dust that hissed across the ground. Inside the shack, Jonas sat by the creaky bamboo bed, watching the stranger breathe in shallow, shaky bursts. Each time she stirred, he leaned in, gently patting her arm, whispering to her like he once did to his little boy. Near midnight, Ahyoka stirred. Her cracked lips parted, and through ragged breaths came a whisper. "Do not. Leave." Jonas startled. He reached for her thin hand and clasped it tightly in his own. "I will not leave you," he said, firmer now, like a vow. In that moment, an invisible thread seemed to pull them together. A poor white man with nothing to his name, and an Apache woman left to die, two survivors, both cast aside by the world. Jonas stayed awake through the night. Each time the fire began to fade, he added more wood. Every time Ahioka coughed, he brought her the bowl of water. Just before dawn, her eyes opened again and met his. And in that gaze beyond the pain was a strange flicker of light, a flicker of trust. And Jonas understood, from that moment on, he was no longer alone. The sun had not yet risen above the horizon, but inside the crumbling shack, the fire had already faded to glowing red embers. Jonas still sat there, his back against the wall, eyes heavy with exhaustion but never straying from the Apache woman lying on the bamboo bed. Ahioka stirred slightly. Her thin hand reached out, searching through the air. Jonas reached forward and took it, his large, calloused hand wrapping around her frail fingers. Her eyes opened slightly, cloudy at first, but when she recognized him, the corners of her lips trembled into a tired smile. "You saved me," she said. Her English broken, voice rough like wind through dry grass. Jonas froze for a second. That short sentence after all these long, shadowed years hit him square in the chest. He nodded slowly, his voice hoarse. No one deserves to be left out there. Though, through the early morning, Jonas mixed the last bit of cornmeal with water and spooned it to Ahioka, one careful sip at a time. She drank slowly, eyes closed, each swallow a quiet battle. As strength began to return to her, she started speaking more, though mostly in her native language, words Jonas could not understand. But in every sound he heard a kind of broken sorrow. At times, she wept in silence, tears sliding from tightly shut eyes. Jonas placed a heavy hand on her shoulder, no words, just presence. And in that silence, Ahioka's shaking eased. Her shoulders loosened, like a child who had finally found something to lean on. Outside, the morning wind swept red dust into curling whirlwinds. The prairie seemed to be warning of something grim. Jonas knew he now held a secret he had never asked for. An Apache woman, left to die on his land, such a thing, in the eyes of the tribe, could mark him as a villain with nothing more than a whisper. And yet, looking at Ahioka lying there, the flickering light revealing a worn face still full of quiet strength, Jonas felt no regret. Something inside him had shifted. Where he once wanted only solitude, he now found himself standing between life and death for another human being. Last night, he had offered her a single sip of water, but that sip had bound their fates together. What Jonas did not know was that beyond those hills, the entire tribe already knew what he had done. And as the first rays of dawn broke across the horizon, the pounding of hooves would return, this time to carry him into a circle of fire greater than any nightmare he had ever known. Thank you so much for being here. If this story stirred something in you, memories of dusty sunsets, or the echo of hoofbeats in your heart, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. So each day we can sit down together, and I will tell you another story from the West. The first sound of hoofbeats echoed from afar, like thunder rolling across the mist-covered plains. Jonas jolted upright, instinctively reaching for the old rifle hanging on the wall. On the bamboo bed, Ahioka's eyes flew open in panic. She whispered something in her native tongue, her voice trembling. Jonas could not understand the words, but the fear in her eyes said everything. In no time, the distant rumble became a storm. The earth shook in waves, red dust curling into a haze on the horizon. And then, the horses appeared, dozens of Apache warriors charging forward, forming a half-moon around the battered shack. Spears held high, bows drawn tight, the morning firelight flickering across their faces painted in cold, warlike patterns. Jonas stepped to the door, rifle in hand, though he knew full well he was nothing against this force. His heart pounded, sweat beaded at the back of his neck, but he stood firm, his lean frame facing down the tightening circle. From among the warriors, an old chief urged his horse forward. His silver hair danced in the wind, a deerskin cloak draped across his shoulders. His deep black eyes locked onto Jonas, cold as a blade. "Jonas Hale," he said, voice rough and low, each word landing heavy as stone. You have touched the blood of our people. The Council of Elders calls for you. Come now. Jonas tightened his grip on the rifle, ready to speak, to explain, but then he looked back. In the narrow doorway, Ahioka had propped herself up on one arm. Her face was pale, her eyes pleading. She shook her head slowly, her lips quivering as she whispered a single word in English. Go, he faltered. In that moment, Jonas understood. If he stayed, blood would be spilled, and the woman he had saved the night before would be the first to see it. With a heavy breath, Jonas lowered the rifle. He raised both hands in the air, a gesture of surrender, but his gaze remained steady. The old chief nodded. 2 warriors rode forward, swinging ropes to bind Jonas's wrists. The horses turned, kicking up clouds of red dust. They took Jonas away, leaving behind the crumbling shack and the fragile woman sitting by the early morning fire. Jonas knew his life had been forever changed by a single sip of water, and now he was being led to the place where his true fate awaited the circle of fire that was the tribal council. Jonas was escorted across the prairie. The morning mist clung thick to his hair and tattered coat, sending chills through his body. But the cold was nothing compared to the weight pressing in his chest. He had no idea where he was being taken. All he could hear was the relentless pounding of hooves around him, like war drums escorting a man to his execution. When the sun finally rose above the horizon, the riders came to a halt. Before Jonas stretched a wide valley. In the center burned a great circle of fire. Dozens of Apache elders sat in a ring, and behind them stood hundreds of warriors, armed and watchful. The sound of wind flutes echoed in the air, blending with deep, rhythmic drums. The entire scene radiated a sacred, solemn power both majestic and terrifying. Jonas was pushed into the center of the ring. The rope around his wrists bit into his skin, and his boots touched the red earth still damp with dew. Every eye locked onto him, eyes filled with suspicion, anger, and even contempt. A silver-bearded elder rose to his feet, voice sharp and commanding. You, white man, you touched the daughter of the tribe. The old law is clear. Anyone outside our blood who lays hands on one of ours bears the mark of shame. What have you to say for yourself? Jonas took a deep breath and raised his head. His voice was hoarse, but rang clear. Last night, I saw her dying in a ravine. I could not walk away. I gave her water. I dressed her wounds. If saving a life is a crime, then I accept it. But I shamed no one. A wave of murmurs rolled through the circle. Many eyes burned with fury. Another elder growled, You speak lies to escape judgment. Who will stand and bear witness for you? Who will stand and bear witness for you? End quote. End quote. End quote. End quote. Who will stand and bear witness for you? The question struck like a hammer. Jonas fell silent. He glanced around, hoping for a miracle. Then, through the thick, stifling silence, a weak voice called out from behind. Ahioka. She was being helped forward, her wound still bandaged. She stumbled, unsteady, but her eyes burned with clarity. She stepped straight into the circle of fire, looked at Jonas, then turned to the elders. Her voice was raspy, each word heavy but firm. He saved me. If not for him, I would be dead. The valley erupted. Some warriors stared in disbelief. Others growled in protest. The elders exchanged tense looks. The old chief, draped in his deerskin cloak, who had remained silent until now, slowly rose to his feet. His gaze pierced through both Jonas and Ahioka. His voice rumbled. If the words of this daughter are true, then the one who sought her death is not you. But you have interfered with our fate. From this day forward, you are no longer an outsider. You will prove, with blood, who the real enemy island. Jonas swallowed hard, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. He understood. The true trial was still ahead, and it would be a battle of life and death, where truth would be paid for in fire and blood. The fire in the valley crackled and popped, casting flickering light across the angry faces of the elders. The tension in the air was thick, as if a single verdict could spill blood in an instant. Jonas stood in the circle of ropes, sweat rolling down his temples, but his eyes never dropped. Ahioka drew a long breath. Her slender shoulders trembling, she raised her hand, pointing to the bruises on her neck and wrists. then lifted her chin and spoke part in her native tongue, part in broken English. It was not him, not the rancher. The ones who tried to kill me were slavers. A wave of shock swept through the gathering. Warriors turned to each other, gripping their spears tighter. One of the elders growled, "What did you say? Speak clearly." Ahioka went on, her voice hoarse but steady. She told them days ago, while fetching water near the town, she stumbled upon white slavers making a deal selling women and children to distant camps. She overheard them, and they caught her. That night, they beat her, tied her up, and left her for dead in the ravine, trying to bury their secret. A young warrior who understood some English stepped forward and translated her words. As he spoke, the circle around the fire exploded in fury. Warriors slammed spear handles against the ground, eyes burning with rage. Ahioka turned to Jonas, her gaze full of trust. He saved me, gave me water, gave me life. Without him, I would not be here to tell the truth. All eyes turned to Jonas. He swallowed hard, his heart still pounding, but he did not speak. The truth had already found its voice. The old chief raised a hand, silencing the crowd. He stepped forward slowly, his face carved with lines like stone, and locked eyes with Jonas. You saved the daughter of our tribe, but that alone is not enough. If her words are true, you will ride with us, and the blood of the enemy will prove your innocence. The fire circle fell silent. The fury in their eyes had shifted. Now they looked to him with something else. Expectation. Jonas felt it clearly. He was no longer a bystander. He had been pulled into the storm, and only his actions could reveal the truth. Ahioka gave him a nod. She was tired, but her eyes gleamed with light. And in that moment, Jonas understood this bond between him and her, and between him and the tribe, had become something deeper. It had become fate. Night fell, and the valley was swallowed in darkness. The great fire had burned down, leaving only glowing red embers. Jonas rode a horse borrowed from the tribe, riding in silence among the Apache warriors. His heart pounded in his chest, like it once did when he wore the uniform of a soldier. But this time, it was not a flag that led him, it was the truth, and the debt he carried. They crossed through the ravine and reached the wooden cabin where the slavers were hiding. Firelight flickered through the cracks, and ugly laughter spilled out with the clatter of metal. Jonas gripped his old rifle tight. His hands trembled, but his eyes turned cold. The chief raised his hand. The entire group went still. Then came a shout that shattered the silence. An arrow whistled through the air and struck the door with a thud. Moments later, gunfire exploded. The assault had begun. Apache warriors charged forward, horses screaming, spears flashing in the firelight. Jonas took cover behind a boulder and aimed. His first shot dropped a man holding a knife. A scream echoed. Flames roared to life as torches were thrown onto the dry wooden roof. The fire began to devour the house. The slavers fought back with wild desperation, but one by one, they fell. Jonas broke cover when he saw a large man swinging an axe toward Ahioka. Without thinking, he raised his rifle and pulled the trigger. The crack of the shot rang through the chaos, and the man collapsed beneath the firelight. Jonas stood there, panting, the battlefield flashing in his mind once more. But this time, he was fighting for something right. The battle raged until midnight, then fell silent. The hideout lay in ashes, while the silhouettes of Apache warriors stood tall in the firelight. The old chief stepped forward, his deep black eyes fixed on Jonas for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. You have proven yourself. You are no longer an outsider. From this day on, your honor is bound to the tribe. Ahioka stood behind him. Her face was still pale, but her eyes glowed with quiet strength. She gave him a small nod, a thank you that needed no words. Jonas lowered his rifle and sat down on a stone, looking up at the star-filled sky. For the first time in years, he felt something stirring in his chest, not just old scars, but life. A single sip of water had bound him to a fate far greater than he had ever imagined. And now, he knew. He had found a reason to keep going. In the West, Jonas thought, justice is not written in ink. It is carved in fire, in blood, and in the courage of those who dare to stand against the storm. One sip of water, one outstretched hand sometimes, that is all it takes to change a life. Because out here, in a land as brutal as it is beautiful, compassion does not just save others, it saves your own soul. And that is the true justice of the West. Let that compassion take root in each of us, my friends. Thank you so much for being here. Now tell me, what did you feel while listening to this story? Drop a comment down below. Type the number 1 if this story moved you. And do not forget to subscribe, so you never miss the next gripping tale from the Wild West.